Off a new series and a new focus at the beginning of this new year on prayer. And the basic premise of this series is one, that speaking with God, there's a little bit of a click, Brett. We tried to eliminate it. Oh, it's touching me. There we go. Thank you. The premise, number one, is that prayer, speaking with God, both talking to him and hearing him, because it's two-way communication, is arguably the single most important thing for our daily relationship with God. And if anybody's experienced in a human relationship that sense of closeness, camaraderie, perhaps intimacy, where somebody knows you with all your junk and yet they still love you, and you know somebody else with all their stuff and you still love them and you want to be together. That's just a little taste of what God intends for all of us in relationship with him. It's essential and it's powerful, but it's hard to do. That's why we're doing this series. And it's not the first time we've talked about prayer. We need ongoing and continual encouragement and motivation for prayer. We need to be reminded that prayer is not singular, that Paul talks about praying on all sorts of occasions with all types of prayers. And yet for many of us, our prayer life can sort of devolve into just asking or just expressing our wants and needs to God. And our hope for the series is that God would move all of us deeper into, I'll call it like a supernatural flow state, or a communion, or an abiding with him that does several things. It strengthens our sense of identity. It's something that we're all asking, who am I? That we would have a clear sense of who we are as his much-loved children through our prayer life with him. That we would have hope spiked every single day, no matter what you're facing and whatever circumstances your way, that you would have increased measures of hopefulness every single day, and that there would be a greater grit and resolve and power to live for a greater purpose. So we have going alongside this prayer series a 30-day prayer challenge. And I'm curious, how many of you are willing to take the 30-day prayer challenge? Show of hands. That's just freaking cool, because I didn't even tell you what it is. And so either that was naive and going with the peer pressure, or you're like all in. That's cool. Let me tell you what this prayer challenge is. For 5 weeks, one after another, we're going to look at a certified OG prayer slayer from the Bible, and one of that person's template prayers. The challenge for the 30 days is to pray that prayer that week, to follow that pattern. Here's what they are. Praying like Jesus when facing fear and pain. That'll be today. Next week, praying like David to get up after screwing up. Then praying like Hannah in your angst and your appreciation. Praying like Nehemiah to be used by God. And praying like Paul for big things in others' lives. There's 3 other resources that go along with the challenge that'll come out of the message. One is you're digging deeper, or for you guys who are tracking along online, there should be a link that's put in there for you. And that has helpful resources that each of us who brings the message and the teaching team as a whole have curated and shared with you to take it a step deeper. And then there's going to be a prayer station, not only here at the cross and at the back after services, but out in the lobby. And the one in the lobby is new for us. And sometimes we think we just get busy, but it's going to be there, and we're going to encourage you to jump in and get prayer. And each of those stations has some of those cards with words from God that he spoke through you last week, that you laid here on the stage. We've collected those, we've distributed those. And so as you go for prayer, you're also going to get a word from God that comes through, part of the body of Christ. So the last resource is just one another. We just want to encourage you to increase your intentionality before and after services. When you're talking with someone, to say, well, hey, could we pray about that right now? And that would happen here in the rows and out there in the lobby and back there in the kids' wing, that these 3 things would happen as part of this 30-day prayer challenge. The first one here is facing fear and pain. And I know this is sobering. It's hard. It doesn't feel like a happy start to the new year. And yet, I look out in your eyes and I know enough of you, and I know statistics to know this is something you're facing right now. And if it's not something you're facing right now, it's something you will face in some measure or another. And it's very easy. There's part of our brain that shuts out the potential of bad things that could happen. Why? Because if that thing didn't work, we wouldn't get out of bed in the morning. We would be immobilized and paralyzed by fear. And sometimes that thing in the brain that's supposed to do that doesn't work so well, and some people are stuck and hindered and limited. But God wants us to be free, and he wants us to fulfill our highest purposes predestined for us. And so rather than trying to hide from, no, I don't want to think about it, change the subject, why don't we actually look to see what God has to say to us about this? Now, I'm going to guess that you guys are like me, and there's times when you need to do something you don't want to do, and you're reluctant. And as a follower of Jesus, he tells us we deny ourselves, we take up our cross, and we follow him. And that's hard. And that's normal for human beings to want to avoid pain and sacrifice and suffering. And the people who don't have that feeling have something wrong in their amygdala that causes them to like pain or to have zero qualms about the potential for pain. So it's normal. Some of us in this room live with a nervous, underlying anxiety about what's going to happen. It's just part of life. There's times and seasons when stress from responsibility spikes and we have these stress headaches and we're tense. There's times when in our gut, it's just churning with dread. It could be about a health situation, real, diagnosed, or potential, hypothetical, whether us or someone else. Could be a financial challenge, a threat of something, hardship financially, a lawsuit. Who knows what it could be? Business difficulty, job loss. Could be emotional and mental, and perhaps the hardest, the relational. Those fears and those concerns and those awful times and seasons of life when relationships, they're not working out like they are supposed to. And then we feel that for other people. So it's not just that for ourselves. We feel it for other people. And I just remember a time in my life when I had a really hard time getting out of bed. And some of you are in that. I might be looking in your eyes right now. You're maybe watching this in bed right now. And I just need to stop and pause for a minute and just almost have like a sacred moment of silence. It's like a moment of camaraderie for the broken. Father, I don't want to just say what's on this paper, what's in my head. We want to dial into your heart, to your will and your ways. Would you show us something that will change everything with the fear and the pain and the suffering and the hardship of life? In the name of Jesus, I pray. Amen. I'm going to switch over to the iPad if I could at this time. Make sure I got it turned on. Okay. I think this is how I'll illustrate how it works for a lot of us. We're cruising along in life, headed somewhere, and then it happens. That terrible lightning strike of something that hurts. And for all of us, this happens when we're young. It continues to happen through all of our days on this earth because it's a broken world. And the way we handle that and respond to that is, again, we're cruising along, and when it happens, it, for some people, completely wrecks them to the point that they can't keep living. Most of us, I think, kind of stabilize and keep plugging along, although differently. Psychologists talk about emotional suppression, emotional avoidance, emotional numbing, at the extreme cases, dissociation, where to protect our hearts, we put up walls and we bury it. And we don't make ourselves vulnerable because we don't want to be hurt again. To me, that's this life down here. It's below what our life would have been. It's somehow, in some sense, less human, and it does not move forward with the full measure of what God intended for us. And I think what can happen is not only the traumatic events or the fear of painful events can cause us to pull back. The problem with pulling back and shutting down our heart is if you don't feel the pain, you also don't feel the joy. You become somehow less than the human that you were meant to live. And when you have an injury, for instance, in athletics, you don't perform to the same potential or at the same level. And so what's happening is those of us who are followers of Jesus, in our desire to follow in his footsteps, we pull back to protect ourselves. Now, I don't know if you've ever met somebody who, when a crisis hits, somehow it seems to be catalytic in their life, to take them like to a different level. It like they tap into something. I mean, I remember reading and hearing about the stories of martyrs burning at the stake, getting killed at the firing line, loving and forgiving the people that are doing this to them. I thought, that's a higher plane, man. That's taking it up a level. My question for you is, which of these was what Jesus did in his life? What's the example of Jesus? And I'm going to suggest it's none of these three. It's actually some kind of a combination of them. Because we see Jesus, and as we'll see today, he felt the full, raw, human experience of suffering and grief. And yet, he didn't stay there. He worked through it, and he worked through it again, and he worked through it again. And that launched him and catapulted him with a chiseled resolve, a courage, and a conviction to do what was absolutely unthinkable. And this is what we're going to look at today, is Matthew chapter 26, verses 36 to 46. And this has been called the Gethsemane prayer. And I'm going to call it the prayer of struggle and surrender. And I propose that we see in Jesus a pattern and some principles that when we're staring in the face of pain and suffering, and we're pulling back to try to keep ourselves safe and comfortable, and missing the fullness of a supernatural divine download of strength through our weakness and purpose that's exponentially greater. I think we're going to see his example. It's honest, real, raw, authentic awareness. A lot of people, I'm not just going to say men and women, have shut that part of ourselves down. Stoicism is a popular philosophy. Many people are guys in particular, are being drawn to, somehow being above and aloof and detached from our emotions. We see something different in Jesus. And at the same time, we see that he didn't just get swallowed up in the pain. He used it. He's like he threw a saddle on it, and he used it to drive him deeper into the heart of God to find a willingness to surrender. And then he did it again because he had to do it again because he was struggling, and he did it again until it was time, and it was done, and it was final. And it sent him into a whole nother trajectory. And that's, again, what we're going to look at here. Let me give you the context. He's in Jerusalem. And the fever pitch of intensity in the culture in the city of Jerusalem and the whole region of Palestine was at its peak. And he knew what was coming. It says in Matthew 26:2, he told his disciples, "You know that after 2 days the Passover is coming, and the Son of Man will be delivered up to be crucified." There's a storm on the horizon, and it's about to break. The religious leaders were already plotting to arrest him and to do it in a way that was like private and quiet so it didn't create an uproar. And Judas was secretly making plans to be the one to betray Jesus when he was alone. And Jesus knew this. In fact, he said at the Passover feast, "Truly I say to you, one of you will betray me." And when he looked in Judas' eyes, he felt that cold satanic chill. He could see the knife that was going to be plunged in his back, and he felt it deeply. Continuing on, and when they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. And then Jesus went with them to a place called Gethsemane. It was a place not far from the city. It was a place that was more remote and quiet, and yet nearby and somewhat accessible. It was a place he went often to pray. And he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." And taking with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, he began to be sorrowful and troubled. And then he said to them, "My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch with me." And going a little farther, he fell on his face and he prayed, saying, "My Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me." This is fascinating. What was the cup that he didn't want to drink? We know that there was an incredible physical suffering that was awaiting him. Has anybody here been waterboarded? Anyone? If you know, no. You've seen a movie maybe of waterboarding. What's the big deal? Why is that a form of torture? Because our bodies psychologically resist the idea of suffocation. The Romans perfected crucifixion not as an act of death, but as an act of prolonged torture, emotionally, physically, and emotionally, psychologically. And so ultimately you die by asphyxiation, where you can no longer have the strength to lift yourself up to take in air into your lungs. You basically drown with the inability to breathe after what could even be days at times. So that's one thing, but people die from physical suffering all the time. People are suffering and being tortured right now. It's awful. But there's psychological, the public humiliation. What's everyone's worst dream? Standing there naked in front of a crowd. There he is, naked, but nobody's there. His closest followers, yes, mom's there, but his closest followers aren't there. They're gone. And he knew they were going to abandon him, and a couple muster up the courage to come back. But he feels that again, that betrayal, the knife in his back. And then the worst of all was the spiritual reality. And here's how I would picture this. Picture a rag, and it's wiping through history to all the genocide. It's going into the concentration camps. It's going to the killing fields. All the vile, awful, wicked things that human beings have done to one another. And it's being wrung into this awful cup. And then think about the experience not of the perpetrator, but of the victims, the people who've suffered. Horrendous. Unthinkable. I don't even want to try and come up with words. And all of that suffering is taken, it's wrung out in another cup. The cup of human suffering. And then the collective alienation and despair and hopelessness and ultimately death of the human experiment is all in these cups. And then in Jesus, they're poured out together into one wicked, sickening mixture. And that, friends, is the cup that's laid before him to drink. And Jesus says, "If it's possible, Father, there must be some other way." That's Jesus saying, the Son of God, who came here knowing that's what he was going to do, but when it was finally time, saying, "I can't do it. I can't do it." And I know we can rationalize it in our mind, it's just a couple hours. No, it's all of the ages and the generations of the injustice and the pain and the grief. It's all poured into one single moment in human history. And that Jesus experiencing for the first time separation from the infinite love and the glory of the Father that he had never not known. So yeah, I get it. And you know what? I get why you don't want to have to face some of what awaits you. And I get why you also, like me, want to protect yourself from having to drink your cup of suffering. And yet, we see in Jesus a movement where he went from, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me, to, nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. Let your will be done. So what happened there? How did he get from, no, I can't, there's got to be some other way, to, okay, I'm willing? And how much time took place? We read it as if it was one prayer. And we read the Psalms with their laments that are poured out to God as if somebody just sat down and in 2 minutes got there. It could have been tens of minutes. It could have been an hour. And yet Jesus worked through the pain to not just stay there, but to reach a point. I wish I knew what helped him, because if I knew what helped him, maybe it would help me face the stuff that I have to face, that I don't want to face, or to help me do the things that I need to do. Well, guess what? We do know what helps him. And I want to share just a couple things. We know that Hebrews 12, 1-2, in verse 2 specifically says, for the joy set before him, Jesus endured the cross, scorning its shame. And so what was the joy set before him? It doesn't tell us here, but I have some theories. If we keep reading about what happened in the Garden of Gethsemane, it says when they came to arrest him later, one of the disciples, he gets a sword and he tries to fight. And Jesus says, put your sword back in its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels? And this is the point for some of you in your suffering. You're thinking, God, if you cared about me, why wouldn't you do something? I thought you had the power to help. Jesus knew the Father had the power, and yet it didn't torment him because of what comes next. But how then should the scriptures be fulfilled? That it must be so. He knew there was a destiny of what God could do that was far greater only through the suffering and not in spite of or instead of it. And he says the same thing. At that hour, Jesus said to the crowds, have you come out against a robber with swords and clubs to capture me? Day after day I sat in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me. But all this has taken place, and there it is again, that the scriptures of the prophets might be fulfilled. He was fixated on the idea of destiny. He was fixated on the idea that there were things scripted and predetermined for him to do that was God's will in and through the suffering, and that it was part of this mysteriousness of the way God redeems the pain and the brokenness of this life for a greater good. And so I'm just thinking, wow, when I'm facing fears and pains that might make me want to step aside or shut down, what if I believed, like Jesus, that God had assignments for me in the midst of and through the pain? And guys, I got to tell you, that has helped me tremendously when catastrophic loss has hit my life, to believe that God is, to even count it a badge of honor, that he would choose me, that he would so believe in me and the Durler family to allow us to suffer short term for eternal glory. The second thing I think that helped him, hours later, he's facing this mock trial, and the high priest says to him, I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you're the Christ, the Son of God. And Jesus said to him, you have said so, but I tell you, from now on you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. I don't see a weak, suffering, sorrowful Jesus anymore. I see somebody who took that cup. I was going to drink this. I don't have it in me, Lord. Surely there's some other way. I see somebody who drank that cup and it changed him. It freed him from the suffering, even though he still had to walk through it. And so Jesus looked past it, and you know what he saw? He saw vindication, and he saw the vanquishing of evil. The joy set before him was God's righteousness and justice prevailing as mercy pours into the hearts of all who are willing to receive this free gift, and fellowship eternal exists. Back in the glories, basking in the goodness of God, in fellowship with one another on a perfect planet again. And I'm just thinking for myself, man, if I could see past the pain and I could almost use it as a prism to look through it into the glory on the other side, that might help me make it. That might help me go forward. But here's the crazy thing. Jesus didn't just say, all right, I surrender, thy will be done, and drink it. He had to do it again and again. And this is powerful for us. He came to the disciples and he found them sleeping, and he said to Peter, so, could you not watch with me 1 hour? Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. And so again, for a second time, he went away and he prayed. And notice his prayer. It's very similar and yet different. First he said, oh God, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me. Surely there must be some other way, but thy will be done. The second time he prays is, okay, if it's not possible. He's coming to a place of greater acceptance that this is his cross to bear, this is his burden, this is his cup to drink. And he says it again, thy will, your will be done. And then he came to his disciple, so he says, if I cannot drink it, your will be done. And then he says, here it is, he found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy. So leaving them again, he doesn't even wake them this time. You see how it doesn't phase him. He doesn't get ticked off. He doesn't get hacked off. He doesn't say, what's the point? You guys can't even. No, he just says, all right, I get it. And he goes back and he prays a third time, saying the same words again. And that's the point, I think, that he finally said, it's time. He said, sleep, take your rest later on. The hour's at hand. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand. He was finally ready. He had worked it through and worked it through at a deeper level and worked it through at the deepest level. And as he knelt there, just praying and dripping tears of blood, he was feet from a fence that could have taken him out through the night, and he could have bolted. But he didn't do it. He fought through his resistance to surrender, to yield himself to God, to embrace his destiny, and to experience a supernatural grit, courage, resolve, even joy in the midst of. He fought his way into acceptance of the suffering, and in the very act of doing that, he found freedom from its grip on him. And that's the big idea. And that's our challenge for this week. Jesus shows us how to face the fear and pain for a greater purpose. He gives us a process, and he gives us what I'm going to call 4 principles. Number 1, find a quiet, isolated place to process what you're feeling and facing. See, we don't even do this. We don't experience the breakthrough, the transformation that Jesus experienced because we just stay busy. We just don't want to deal with it. You know, he could have just said, let me just get some rest. I'm going to be going through what I just need a little bit of sleep. Jesus knew he needed something even stronger than sleep. And so he found a place of solitude. And what's interesting, his solitude was a physical place. Some of you find it in a park. Some of you maybe have a place in where you live, where you can go, where there's quietness, where you can meet with God. Some people don't even, it's like bathroom, like that's the only place. And so you go for a long time into the bathroom, your car. But it was also a time of day. You might live in a crazy house. How crazy is it at 1 a.m.? Maybe some of us need to follow Jesus' example to find that place to face it, not just by going somewhere physically, but looking at a time when we can get away from all the other stuff. Second, raw honesty. Admitting and feeling the fear and pain and bringing it to God. You know, we numb it, we repress it, we don't want to deal with it. Sometimes we don't even realize we're doing it. But Jesus said, my soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. And I wonder, for some of us who are so afraid of the pain, my favorite quote about this with grief is the fastest way to the light of dawn is not to run westward chasing the setting sun. It's to turn and plunge headlong eastward into the thick of the darkness and not stop there, but keep going and keep going, only to more quickly find the dawn of the next morning. So we've got to plunge into the darkness. We've got to feel it and face it authentically. And then third, don't try to do it alone. Look for a few friends to pray with you. And at the very same time, don't put all your hope in them. Don't, because they are going to fail you. The spirit's willing, but the flesh is weak. Don't let their flakiness phase you. And we see that with Jesus. And so I just want to encourage you guys this week, as you're seeking to model this, as you're carving out a time of your day or night to get with God with what your fears are for this year, the pain that you're facing, the challenges, to not try and do it alone. Look for and ask for people to pray with you. And at the same time, don't put all your trust in that. And then number 4, keep at it. Keep at it. Keep at it. Fight for it. And when you lose it, get back into that garden and fight for it again. Until the time comes when it's done and it's final. And that time, you'll know when that time is. Here's what the prayer pattern looks like. It's not complicated, guys. This is super simple. It's 3 things. And I think one of the reasons most of us don't experience more of Jesus' victory in our lives is because we don't do all 3. The first is the struggle. We superficially think we're surrendering. Your will be done. But we haven't really gotten to a place that we mean that at the core of our being. What does that sound like? It sounds like saying, God, I'm afraid. I'm afraid of this. God, I don't want to have to do this. Or even I can't do this. And the problem for a lot of us is, oh, I do that, but that's all I do. I don't take it to the next level, and that's the surrender. That's the submission to God's will. That's trying to look through the pain to see what's past it. That's trying to come to the place where we say, there's a purpose for me in the midst of this struggle and sacrifice that is for your glory. And here's what it sounds like. I trust you, God, to work it out. I trust you, God, to use the way I deal with this diagnosis, this terminal thing in my beloved family member, this sudden unexpected death or miscarriage, this lawsuit, this financial loss, this betrayal of a business partner. I trust you, God, to use the way I do this by your strength for greater good. And so I look forward to that with a joy set before me, knowing there will be people who experience the eternal joys of heaven because they've seen in real life the miracle of God's existence through my suffering. And God, I believe you will help me to do it. I can't, but you can. Let's go. So I'm going to have the band come up. That's the process. Struggle, surrender, but it's not over yet. Sometimes we got to do it again and again and again, as often as necessary until it's done or until it's time. And I wonder if Jesus would have had more time if there would have been a round 4 and a round 5. I don't know, but I do know this. You'll know. And I need to say this. Is there anybody in this room that can say, I have surrendered to God in the face of suffering and experienced his power and his presence? I see that hand. Yes. These hands, these are people in the room. You should ask them, how did you experience that? Jesus has set the example. I testify to seeing it in my wife in these past 6 years in a remarkable way. But you know what? She did it with the little sufferings before the big suffering. So once you stand to your feet, our big idea, Jesus shows us how to face the fear and pain for a greater purpose. The challenge is to do it this week. Find that solitary place. Ask a few people to pray with you. And then be real in the struggle. But grab onto the promises that are a bedrock so that you can let go and say, thy will be done. And this song, I think, helps us do that. We've got a prayer team. I see Ken is over here. I don't see somebody in the back, but I'll go back to that corner, and then we'll have somebody out in the lobby as well. Let's worship God.